Hello, and welcome to another of my podcast series. Now, the last podcast series I did was about diabetes as a disease and the intersections with food and lifestyle in ways which go beyond sort of what the medical consensus is in the United States, but follows the scientific consensus in the scientific literature. So that podcast series is concluded, and I thought carefully about what to do on the next one. And I decided to do one on the current Russo-Ukraine war. Thought a lot and very hard about this because there are a lot of people doing these podcasts solely sort of as a way of drumming up numbers, drumming up views, that sort of thing. And my view is that if you don't have something unique to bring as a perspective and something which is fundamentally constructive, then it's almost, it is irresponsible to effectively exploit this issue in that way. But it occurred to me that there were a couple of reasons why it was important that I join this debate or not even a debate, but this issue with this channel. And the first is that as I've been watching a lot of commentary on YouTube, what I found is that everybody's really broken into camps. And there isn't really anybody trying to advocate everybody else's position to each other. And as a result of that, what you find is that some people will go and they'll watch a lot of the mainstream commentary. Other people will go and they'll watch stuff from folks who are in the populist right. And the perspectives you get from these don't match up. As we can all know, a lot of the news is propaganda. This goes for Western sources, it goes for Russian sources, it goes for everyone around. And so getting a handle on this issue is difficult, and what we're really lacking is we're lacking efforts to, as I say, advocate for each other and try to bring people together. The second thing which puts me in a position to try to do this is, as somebody who's lived and worked on 3 different continents, I've known a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives. And this has included people in Southeast Asia, people in Russia, people in Ukraine. And as a result, I think I can at least attempt, and of course it's a very flawed attempt, but I can at least attempt to provide a wider shared understanding of many of the issues going on in this conflict. So before I begin my other series, or the whole series on this issue, what I would like to do is I'd like to talk about first principles, because if we're going to jump into a divisive issue, then it's really helpful for first principles to be stated up front so that we can actually discuss where we disagree, and from there we can hopefully actually engage in dialogue. So in this particular episode, I'm just going to talk about questions relating to what I hope comes out of this horrible conflict and the guiding principles that steer me in terms of trying to understand how everybody should be acting. Because obviously, if everybody was acting as they should, this conflict, while it might still exist, would not have the global impact that it does. So, what I hope comes out of this conflict is a just peace. I'm not very hopeful about that at the moment. But my view on politics is that the only permissible exercise of politics needs to be aimed at coexistence. And war, as von Clausewitz pointed out and others since him, to a large extent is politics through other means. If the goal isn't a greater coexistence, then it's simply a question of domination. And that's the sort of thing which is going to lead to terrible injustice. And a result from this war, which I fear will come back to haunt the entire world for many decades to come. So let's start with first principles. What is politics? Why do we have it? What function does it serve? Well, there are multiple different theories of society. I follow a very Aristotelian theory. The idea is that as we humans come together, we form household units which then have to interact in solving other problems. You know, extended families may have to work together on solving their problems. And community comes out of that interaction. So people who live nearby each other will have common issues. They may be things like, how do we dispose of our garbage? They may be things like, where do we get our drinking water? But they will have common problems, and they have to come together to solve those problems. From this arises the first political unit, which is going to be sort of the community. And then because communities are going to have shared problems that they need help solving, that they need to collaborate on solving, you will have larger political units arise out of that. This is very different from the liberal state theory. The liberal state theory tends to hold that nations are collections of individuals bound together in common purpose through the state. The problem with this theory is that it leads very oftentimes to the sorts of cultural conflicts that we see in the culture wars in the United States, as well as civil wars and other conflicts throughout the world. So I think the Aristotelian framework is a much more constructive framework for dealing with issues, especially ones which are as divisive or as polarizing as war and peace issues often are. So, going further from there, as human beings, we have two fundamental drives in politics. The first one is to solve the problems that we have in collaboration with other people. In other words, we're going to go out, we're going to work with our neighbors to try to solve the problems that we have at home. We want to find out where we need to figure out, for example, where we're going to get our drinking water. We come together with our neighbors and, come up with some solutions, build some water infrastructure, and we're good to go. The second problem is domination. People tend to like to dominate others, and this is where injustice comes from. So, as I was mentioning a moment ago, we have two impulses when it comes to politics. The first one is collaboration over problems that we have, and the second one is a tendency to want to prove that we're right, or that we're better than others, or that we're going to crush our opponents, that sort of thing. And my view is that the former impulse allows us to build just communities, while the latter impulse tends to tear people apart, tends to destroy our ability to work together, and tends to lead oftentimes to oppression and all the rest of this. So this is why I say the only permissible approach, the only permissible goal of politics is coexistence. And coexistence across possibly very divisive issues and opinions and things like this. And that the urge to dominate is going to be the thing that causes all the big problems. And in the current war, we see both of these issues at stake. And my particular worry is that the inability to come together and try to figure out how we live together after the conflict is going to cause a lot of problems that we can't really foresee very well right now. Now, as a basic couple of points here, the most powerful military on the European continent, of course, is that of Russia. The second most powerful at the beginning of this war was that of Ukraine. All else being equal, given the fact that defending troops have massive advantages, the Ukrainian army should have been able to hold the Russians just as far as their numbers were concerned. The problem is, Ukraine has been a country in crisis since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And there are a lot of reasons for this. There's a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame going around. But the divisions within the Ukrainian society by itself are ones which completely account for the Russian successes to date. Ukraine's a very divided country. People in the north and west tend to have aggressively anti-Soviet views. They tend to be willing to overlook questions of the degree to which there was collaboration in World War II between some of the nationalist groups and some of the German invaders, while people in the south and east tend to have much more pro-Soviet leanings, tend to have a very different view of World War II, and a very different view of history going forward. There are big linguistic dividing lines, there are big cultural dividing lines, and because of this, and the fact that Ukrainian politics internally have tended to revolve around which of these groups gets to dominate the other group, there's not a lot of public trust. The result of the Maidan riots, I guess would probably be the most neutral way of describing them, was not a turning towards Europe even. It was a ascension of one group of Ukrainians over another. And in the process, they threw away a lot of the work that they were doing towards closer ties with the EU. This included, for example, more inclusive language policies. So this is a good example, as I say, of the urge to dominate coming back and causing problems. Now, the second major point that I want to make in terms of the need for eventual coexistence is that this war will eventually be over in its current form. And if you don't have a settlement that everybody can live with, and that has to include both Ukrainians and Russians, both the Ukrainian state and the Russian state, then all you're going to have is perpetual conflict out of that. And there's a very good possibility that where you have perpetual conflict, that it metastasizes and spreads elsewhere. We saw that with US-sponsored resistance against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, which eventually metastasized into a global terrorist movement that carried out spectacular and terrible attacks on the United States. We don't want to see something like that happen again, because we're not willing to try to push for an inclusive state at the end. And then the third point I want to make is that countries which are involved in this war, and that includes people sending arms, or countries sending arms and things like that, have a responsibility to be protective of all of the interests involved, not only their own interests, but those of Ukraine also. And I have very strong concerns about how that's happening. So in this particular series, what I'm going to talk about, among other things, are what national and subnational interests are in this conflict, within Ukraine, of Russia, of Western Europe, of Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa. And this will help people understand why the West has kind of started to stand alone on this issue. It'll also help understand that, war isn't about good and bad. It's usually about bad and worse, and sometimes bad and worse can be kind of difficult to distinguish. Along the way, I'll try to talk about what I see as likely explanations for some of the terrible incidents that have happened in this war. In this channel, I will never dehumanize anybody. You won't hear me refer to anybody using words that either express that they're one side or another is subhuman, or completely evil or anything like that. We have to recognize that everybody out there has the capacity to be correct on some things, and that we only learn from each other where there is a difference in opinion, and therefore we have to be respectful. So that's the launching point for this series. I hope that people will find it useful and interesting, and something where we can at least start talking about the kind of just peace that has to follow this terrible conflict. One last point. If you are completely attached to one side, to the point where you're not willing to take criticism on that side, you will not want to watch this series. I can guarantee you that every major bloc will come under criticism. There are areas where all participants in this conflict are doing things that are counterproductive at best, and atrocious at worst. And while that's not necessarily to draw moral equivalences between it, it is worth noting that oftentimes there aren't objective weights between dissimilar evils. So that's the main thing I have to say today. I think the next episode that I do on this will be about the internal divisions and the crises that the Ukrainian state has had since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and why that's the case, why reformers and very responsible politicians, including Zelensky, have been unable to make progress, and why we all need to have some degree of skepticism about how we think about different groups within the Ukrainian camp. It's important, I think, to start there because that's where the war is, and because if Ukraine were a politically healthy country, there would not be the degree of success that the Russians have had here. So that's all I have today. We'll talk more next week. Have a great